36 times. That's how many times Bumpy Johnson's blade found its target in a single Harlem restaurant fight. By cut number 12, Ulysses Rollins was already finished. By cut 24, he was permanently blinded. By cut 36, 200 witnesses were too terrified to breathe. Then Bumpy did something nobody expected. He stood up, adjusted his tie, stepped over the body like it was a puddle, and told the waiter he wanted spaghetti. This wasn't just a fight. This was a message, and everyone in Harlem got it. Summer of 1935, Harlem, New York. If you walked down Lenox Avenue that year, you could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The streets belonged to two forces that were about to collide. On one side, Dutch Schultz, the German Jewish mobster who controlled half of New York's underworld. He wanted Harlem's numbers racket, all of it, and he didn't care how many black bodies he had to step over to take it. On the other side, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a 30-year-old enforcer who'd already earned a reputation as Harlem's most dangerous man. He worked for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the brilliant numbers queen who'd built an empire from nothing. And Bumpy had made her a promise: Harlem stays black, no matter what. Dutch Schultz had already sent dozens of men into Harlem. Bumpy and his crew of 9 had been picking them off one by one. It was easy, his wife Mamie would later write, since there were few white men walking around Harlem during the day. But Schultz was getting desperate. He needed someone who could handle Bumpy Johnson, someone who wasn't afraid, someone who could match Bumpy's violence with violence. That's when he called Chicago. Ulysses Rollins was 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. He'd killed 11 men before his 25th birthday. In Chicago, they called him the Bull, because once he charged, you couldn't stop him. Schultz paid him $5,000 up front and promised him $10,000 more if he could eliminate Bumpy Johnson. "Make it loud," Schultz told him. "Make it public. I want every numbers runner in Harlem to know what happens when they resist." Rollins arrived in Harlem on a Tuesday. By Thursday, word had spread. Dutch Schultz's new enforcer was in town, and he was looking for Bumpy. But here's what Rollins didn't understand about Harlem. In Bumpy's neighborhood, the streets had eyes. The shoeshine boys, the newspaper vendors, the women selling flowers on corners, they all worked for Bumpy. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew Rollins was in town. He knew what hotel he was staying at. He knew what he ate for breakfast. He knew Rollins was carrying a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster and a knife in his boot. And Bumpy knew something else. Rollins was watching him. That Friday night, Bumpy had a date. Not with a Harlem girl, but with Helen Lawson, a senior editor and film critic at Vanity Fair magazine. Helen was white, sophisticated, educated at Vassar College. She wrote reviews of Broadway shows and interviewed movie stars. She was also fascinated by Bumpy Johnson. They'd met at a jazz club 3 weeks earlier. Helen was doing research for an article about Harlem's Renaissance. Bumpy had been intrigued by this white woman who wasn't afraid to sit in a black club, who asked intelligent questions, who saw Harlem as more than just crime and poverty. "Dinner at the Alhambra?" Bumpy had suggested. "Best jazz in Harlem, and the food isn't bad either." Helen had said yes. The Alhambra Bar and Theater, on the corner of 126th Street and 7th Avenue, was Harlem royalty. Duke Ellington had played there. Billie Holiday had sung there. On Friday nights, the place was packed with 200 people, musicians, hustlers, intellectuals, everyone who was anyone in Harlem. Bumpy arrived at 8 p.m., dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His fedora sat at a precise angle. He looked like a banker, not a killer. Helen was already at the table. She wore a blue dress and pearls. They ordered drinks. The conversation flowed. She asked him about growing up in Charleston. He asked her about working at a magazine where she was only one of 3 women. The jazz quartet was playing something soft and low. The atmosphere was perfect. And then, at 8:47 p.m., the door opened. Ulysses Rollins walked in. Bumpy saw him immediately. The way Rollins moved, shoulders back, eyes scanning the room like a predator, told Bumpy everything. This wasn't a man coming in for dinner. This was a man looking for a target. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Rollins smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who'd found what he was looking for. Helen noticed Bumpy's posture change. The relaxed gentleman she'd been talking to disappeared. In his place was something harder, colder. "Bumpy?" she asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," Bumpy said quietly, not taking his eyes off Rollins. "Everything's fine. Excuse me for just a moment." Rollins made his way through the tables, deliberately, taking his time. He wanted everyone to see this. This was the job Schultz had paid him for, a public execution. When he reached Bumpy's table, he stopped. He was standing. Bumpy was sitting. The power dynamic was clear, or so Rollins thought. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Rollins asked, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Depends who's asking." "Dutch Schultz sends his regards, says you've been a problem, says problems need to be solved." The jazz quartet was still playing, but the conversations around them were dying out. People sensed something was about to happen. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy said calmly, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed. Big words for a man sitting down. That's when Bumpy noticed it. Rollins' hand was drifting toward his jacket, toward the pistol in his shoulder holster, and Bumpy made a decision. If Rollins drew that gun, people would die. Innocent people. Helen, the jazz musicians, the waiters. Bullets don't care who they hit in a crowded room. So Bumpy moved first. It happened so fast that most people didn't see the beginning, only the end. Bumpy's hand shot out, not toward Rollins, but toward the table. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the steak knife beside his dinner plate. The knife was 6 inches long, serrated edge, sharp enough to cut through bone. Rollins saw the movement. His hand went for his gun, but Bumpy was already moving. He exploded up from his chair with a speed that didn't seem human. The chair fell backward. Helen gasped, and Bumpy drove the knife forward. The first cut caught Rollins across the forearm as he drew his pistol. The gun clattered to the floor. The second cut opened Rollins' cheek. By the third cut, Rollins realized he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting something else, something that moved like water and struck like lightning. They crashed into a nearby table. Glasses shattered. Food went flying. People screamed and scattered. But Bumpy didn't stop. Cut 4, cut 5, cut 6. Rollins tried to fight back. He was bigger, stronger, but Bumpy was faster. Every time Rollins swung, Bumpy slipped the punch and the knife found flesh. Cut 12 caught Rollins across the ribs. Cut 18 opened his shoulder. By cut 24, Rollins was on his knees. And that's when Bumpy went for the eyes. In the chaos, Helen had moved away from the table, pressed against the wall with other terrified patrons. But she couldn't look away. She watched as Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd been discussing Langston Hughes' poetry 5 minutes earlier, methodically destroyed a man twice his size. The knife was an extension of Bumpy's hand. Every movement was precise, calculated. This wasn't rage. This was mathematics. Cut 25 caught Rollins above his left eye. The blade went deep. When Bumpy pulled it back, Rollins' eyeball came with it, permanently destroying his vision, the damage severe and irreversible. Rollins screamed, a sound Helen would hear in her nightmares for years. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Even the jazz quartet had stopped playing. 200 people stood frozen, watching something out of a horror story. Bumpy stood up. Rollins was still on the floor, bleeding, his face a mask of blood. He was conscious but broken, whimpering. And Bumpy, covered in blood that wasn't his own, did something nobody expected. He reached down and straightened his tie. The gesture was so calm, so deliberate, that it sent a chill through every person in that room. This man had just destroyed another human being, and he was adjusting his wardrobe like he'd just finished a business meeting. Then Bumpy stepped over Rollins's body, not around it, over it, like Rollins was a puddle in his path. He walked back to his table where his chair still lay on its side. He picked it up, set it upright, sat down. Helen was still standing by the wall, staring at him. Bumpy looked at her and smiled, the same charming smile he'd given her when she arrived. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was perfectly calm, as if nothing had happened. Then he looked around for their waiter, who was pressed against the bar, white-faced with shock. "Excuse me," Bumpy called out. "Could we get some menus? I seem to have worked up an appetite." The waiter didn't move. Nobody moved. Bumpy picked up a menu himself from a nearby table. He studied it for a moment, then looked up at Helen. "You know what?" he said. "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." The waiter, hands trembling, took the order. Nobody else in the restaurant moved. They just watched. Helen slowly made her way back to the table. Her legs felt like water. She sat down across from Bumpy, who was calmly wiping blood off his hands with a napkin. "You should go," Bumpy said quietly. "This isn't a place you need to be." But Helen couldn't move. She was in shock, yes, but she was also witnessing something she'd never seen before. A man who'd just committed extreme violence, sitting there like he was waiting for his morning coffee. 8 minutes later, the spaghetti arrived. The plate was placed in front of Bumpy by the same trembling waiter. Steam rose from the pasta. The red sauce looked almost black in the dim light of the restaurant. Through the windows, Helen could see an ambulance pulling up outside. Medics were rushing in to collect Ulysses Rollins, who was still on the floor, still breathing, but barely conscious. And Bumpy Johnson picked up his fork. He twirled the pasta slowly, deliberately. Then he took a bite. Helen watched, unable to look away as this man ate. Not quickly, like someone trying to prove a point, but slowly, casually, like he was truly enjoying it. "It's good," Bumpy said, glancing up at her. "You should eat something." Helen looked at her own plate, which had been knocked aside during the fight. She couldn't imagine eating. Her stomach was in knots. But Bumpy ate 3 more bites, each one deliberate, each one a statement. By the time the medics had loaded Rollins onto a stretcher, Bumpy had finished half the plate. The police arrived as Bumpy was setting down his fork. By that time, an ambulance had already taken Ulysses Rollins to Harlem Hospital. He would survive, but he'd never see out of his left eye again. The cops knew better than to arrest Bumpy Johnson. Half of them were on his payroll. The other half knew that in Harlem, Bumpy was the law. "Self-defense," one officer wrote in his report. "Victim drew weapon first. Multiple witnesses confirm." By Saturday morning, the story had spread through Harlem like wildfire. Not just the violence. Everyone in Harlem had seen violence. But the way Bumpy had ended it, the spaghetti, that detail became legendary. Men told their sons, women told their daughters. That's how Bumpy Johnson handles his business, cool as ice, even with blood on his hands. The story reached Dutch Schultz by noon. Schultz was in his office at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx when his lieutenant came in, white-faced. "Boss, Rollins is in the hospital. Bumpy Johnson cut him to pieces in a restaurant, took his eye out." Schultz put down his cigar. "Is Rollins dead?" "No, but—" "Then he failed." Schultz stood up and walked to the window. "You know what the problem is? We keep thinking we can intimidate these Harlem boys. We keep thinking if we send in someone bigger, meaner, stronger, they'll back down. So what do?" Schultz was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would change the course of mob history. "We leave Harlem alone." "What?" "You heard me. Bumpy Johnson just sent a message, and the message is Harlem is not for sale. We've lost 40 men trying to take that neighborhood, 40, and Johnson isn't even breathing hard." Schultz turned to face his lieutenant. "Call Lucky Luciano. Tell him we need a sit-down.
Tell him we need to make a deal with Bumpy Johnson. 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead, killed on orders from Lucky Luciano, and Bumpy would negotiate the deal that would make him the godfather of Harlem, the first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian Mafia. But that Friday night in 1935, at the Alhambra restaurant, Bumpy was just a man having dinner, a man who'd ordered spaghetti, while another man's blood was still wet on the floor. After the police left, Helen asked Bumpy to take her home. She couldn't stay in that restaurant another moment. The smell of the spaghetti sauce mixed with blood had made her feel sick. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Bumpy said as they walked out into the Harlem night. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That man came to kill you." "Yes." "And you knew he was going to." "Yes." "So the whole dinner was what? A trap?" Bumpy stopped walking. He looked at Helen with something that might have been sadness in his eyes. "I didn't set a trap. I just lived my life. But when a man comes to kill you in front of innocent people, you handle it fast and you handle it final, so everyone knows what happens next time." Helen would write about that night years later in a memoir that would never be published. She described Bumpy as the most contradictory man I ever met, a killer who quoted poetry, a gangster who tipped his hat to old women, a violent man who seemed to carry the weight of his violence like a cross. The story of the 36 cuts became legend in Harlem. But here's what most people missed. Bumpy didn't just destroy Ulysses Rollins that night. He destroyed the idea that Harlem could be conquered by outside forces. Every mobster in New York heard the story, every politician, every cop, and they all understood the same message. Harlem protects its own. Bumpy Johnson would go on to rule Harlem for the next 30 years. He'd go to prison twice, serve time in Alcatraz, negotiate with the Italian Mafia, protect Malcolm X, and become a legend. But on that summer night in 1935 at the Alhambra restaurant, with 200 witnesses watching him step over a bleeding man and order spaghetti, Bumpy Johnson taught Harlem and the world a lesson about power. Real power isn't just violence. Any thug can kill. Real power is control. It's precision. It's the ability to destroy a man and then calmly straighten your tie. It's sending a message so clear, so final, that you never have to send it again. Ulysses Rollins never returned to Harlem. In fact, he tried to kill Bumpy one more time, weeks later, at Frank's restaurant on 125th Street. He fired a shot that missed Bumpy, but killed an innocent woman standing nearby. That was Rollins's last act as a free man. He disappeared after that. Some say Bumpy's men found him. Some say he fled back to Chicago. Nobody knows for sure. But everyone knows this. After that night at the Alhambra, when anyone mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name, they did it with respect, or they didn't mention it at all. Years later, an old man who'd been at the restaurant that night was asked what he remembered most. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The spaghetti. I remember thinking, this man just took another man's eye out, and he's sitting there eating pasta like he's at Sunday dinner. Not pretending, actually eating it." That's when I knew. That's when we all knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous. He was something else, something colder, something you don't forget. And that's the truth about legends. They're not born in the big moments. They're born in the small ones, in the details, in the way a man adjusts his tie, in the way he steps over a body, in the way he orders spaghetti. 36 cuts, one message, one legend. That's the night Harlem learned who Bumpy Johnson really was. If this story about Bumpy Johnson's ice-cold power moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. We're dropping these untold Harlem stories every week, and trust me, the next one is even crazier. Drop a comment. Would you have the nerves to order spaghetti after what Bumpy just did? And what do you think happened to Ulysses Rollins after that night? Turn on notifications because next week we're telling you about the time Bumpy walked into Lucky Luciano's office alone and negotiated a deal that changed the Mafia forever. Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given, it was earned. One blade, 36 cuts and 1 order of spaghetti at a time.